All right, welcome to Congress Day, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Breglia, for starting us off. So my name is Stella Lovelady, and I am one of the students with Students on Air that's putting on this event. This is a pilot event that we're putting together to bring together information, citizens, organizations, and representatives to find common ground on key issues to deliver better solutions for democracy. And I put this together with Camila Anderson, Dalgun Gundumor, and Joe Kubicki. We were all part of Students on Air that worked together also with our faculty advisor, Dhruv Deepak, and our event advisor through Democracy on Air, Scott Joy. So we also would like to thank the College of Humanities and Social Sciences for helping bring together this event, including, of course, the Senior Academic Advisor, Professor Lisa Breglia, who just spoke to you. We'd like to thank student government, specifically Nell Palumbo, Aidan Jacobs, and Gabriela Grabowska. I'm sorry if I just mispronounced your name, for all helping bring this together, as well as their advisor, Lauren Kaplan. We also would like to thank Brad Byron, who's the chief editor for the Fourth Estate, who is here today. And we'd like to thank student involvement and event services that have also helped make this possible. So in addition to our town halls in our front ballroom, in our rear ballroom, we also will have different things for students throughout the day as they come through. So we have the office of Senator Tim Kaine and the offices of Representatives Connolly, Wexton, and Spanberger that are represented in the back ballroom. There's also an issues survey in the back ballroom that you can scan and take, and we're gonna have some roundtable discussions that you can go to in the back ballroom once you're done listening to town halls here. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Camila up to start our first town hall.
Thank you, Stella and Lisa, for the wonderful opening remarks and for everyone who made today possible. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Camila Anderson, and I will be facilitating discussion and audience questions for Congressman Connolly and Congresswoman Wexton here today during our first town hall. Their staffers will now introduce them up on stage.
Good morning. My name is Marlon Debuson. I'm the district director for Congressman Connolly. The congressman represents Virginia's 11th congressional district, which encompasses majority of Fairfax County, as far west as Centerville, as far south as Lorton, as far north as Great Falls, and everything outside the 495 Beltway. The congressman is representing the 11th for his 8th term now. Before this, he was on the Board of County Supervisors and the chairman of Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. So in total, 14 years. He's a great boss, and I'm not just saying that because he's in the front row, but Jerry, come on up.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Erica Campo, and I am Congresswoman Wexton's district director. The Congresswoman has been serving the Commonwealth for decades now as a prosecutor, guardian ad litem. She was a state senator in the General Assembly, and now she represents the 10th district. It comprises Loudoun, a little bit of Fairfax, Manassas Park, and Fauquier and Rappahannock recently after redistricting. She is also a wonderful boss. Congresswoman Wexton.
Yeah, just in the middle there.
We don't have to whisper.
Okay.
We're not in church. Thank you.
Yeah, right here. Thank you again for being here with us today. For everyone in the audience, please take this opportunity today to learn more about your representatives and priorities in Congress, and don't be afraid to ask the questions on issues that you truly care about. Congressman Connolly and Congresswoman Wexton, could you please begin by giving us a short introduction about your priorities for the 118th Congress?
After you, Jerry.
Go ahead. Well, first of all, thank you so much for hosting us. I have represented George Mason University for 20 years. And one of my, I think for most of us on our side of the aisle in Congress, trying to preserve democracy, as was referenced at the very beginning of the introductions, I think is, a sacred responsibility. And there are little and big ways you can do that. One of the reasons we have a voting precinct here at George Mason University came out of my office. We thought, why don't we allow the students at George Mason to vote at George Mason, and why don't we encourage them to register to do just that? They can roll out of bed and vote. And over the years, and we were able to get that done through the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, and over the years, the number of people taking advantage of that and voting has really dramatically increased. So voter participation, making it easier to vote, to me, is really important. You will hear people sell you a falsehood, that the problem in America is voting sanctity and making sure fraud does not occur. Well, fraud does not occur. It is a statistically insignificant factor in America. But what is a problem in America is even in a presidential election, 40% of us don't vote. So making it easier for people to register to vote and vote is the name of the game. If you're going to look at a problem, one that can't even be measured statistically and one that's 40%, you don't have to be an engineering wizard here at George Mason University to figure out where you'd put your resources in terms of solving a problem. And yet, all over America, in a number of red states, we are seeing voter suppression in front of our eyes. Just the other day, a major Republican strategist, woman, gave a speech behind closed doors to Republican donors in which she said our goal should be to restrict and limit voting on college campuses because those votes are hurting us. She actually said it explicitly. And that ought to get everybody in a college campus, faculty or students, riled up. This is a democracy. You don't win elections by restricting voting. You win elections by trying to persuade people who do vote to vote for you. That's how the system ought to work. So, both Jennifer and I were at the Capitol on January 6th. I was on the floor of the House. I saw the mob 5 feet away from the floor of the House of Representatives. And that's an image that will always stay with me in terms of what are we fighting for? What's at stake? There were 5 people died that day. And yet there are people to this very day who want you to believe that was just a bunch of tourists who got a little excited. They were people who had set out to overturn a free and fair election because they didn't like the results. And they were willing to resort to violence. And they were incited, tragically, by the then lame duck president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. So those are battles we face every day, Jennifer and I, when we get up and go to Congress. It's not easy. It is very tense. It's very stressful. Polarization is very high. and to work through that to try to get the country's business done is important. Before I end, let me just say, substantively, again, both Jennifer and I were privileged to serve in the 117th Congress, the last Congress. If you look at that Congress, it's one of the most productive Congresses since Lyndon Johnson was in the White House and the Great Society days. We passed infrastructure legislation. We passed the largest environmental bill in history with the Inflation Reduction Act. We passed the largest manufacturing and research and development bill in history with the chip manufacturing bill, which is very forward-looking to try to make sure America keeps its competitive edge with respect to the development and technology and Chinese competition particularly. We passed $5 trillion to save the economy during the worst pandemic in 100 years. And it worked. If you turn the clock back to April of 2020, 3 years ago this very month, the economy was completely tanking. We were approaching 20% unemployment. We were looking at double-digit contraction in the economy, not growth. We were looking at 500,000 small business failures every week. We were looking at whole industries going south and tanking. The investments we made saved local governments and state governments. They saved whole industries like the airline industry, the restaurant industry, the cruise line industry. We took 20% unemployment and made it 3.5%, the lowest unemployment since 1969, and we have a labor shortage today. We took an economy that was contracting by double digits, and we had growth rates of between 2.5% and 3% in the last several quarters, historically high by U.S. standards. And just one measure in all of that, the child tax credit, in one fell swoop, that one provision cut child poverty in America in half. What had taken us 40 years to try to do, we did in less than one, with one visionary creative measure. So we proved government can work. We proved that, in fact, it's essential that it work. And we were willing to make tough decisions and visionary investments that are going to set this country on a much better course as we look to the future. So we took advantage of that window of opportunity, and we made a lot of music. And we did a lot of great things that this country will benefit from for years to come. I'm very proud of having served in that Congress and been part of that, and I know Jennifer is too. Thanks for having me here today.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Wexton. I represent Virginia's 10th District in the United States House of Representatives. So Jerry's in his 15th year, I guess you are. I'm in my 5th year, so the things are a little bit different for the two of us. You know, for me, I came into the Congress at a historic time. The class of 2018, amazing group of people, really amazing folks who ran for office, a lot of whom had never served in elected office before. Abigail Spanberger, our colleague from here from Northern Virginia in the Richmond area, she has never served in elected office before. I had the benefit of serving as a state senator for 5 years before coming to Congress. Boy, am I glad I did that, because Congress is very different from the state legislature. So, you know, my chief of staff turned to me not long into our 3rd term and said, wouldn't it be cool to serve in unprecedented times? Right, because we serve in unprecedented times, we really did. We were sworn in the middle of the longest government shutdown in American history. We finished that year with impeachment number 1, you may recall. We didn't realize at the time it was impeachment number 1. We started 2020, you know, we were off to the races, but before too long we were in the middle of a pandemic, a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And then we finished the year with a historic election, and the big lie took root. We started our 3rd year with the insurrection at the Capitol, and then we finished our year with hopefully things becoming more normal, but the midterms. So things have gotten pretty crazy, but you know, I think that now, by comparison, the 118th Congress seems actually kind of calm. It seems very tame. It seems kind of boring again, which is kind of a good thing. Although we in the Democratic Party have lost our majority. We need that back, and thankfully, but Kevin McCarthy has a very slim majority now. So hopefully we won't be able to do too much damage. But so far it's mostly been a bunch of messaging bills, a bunch of things trying to divide us. very little in the way of actual policy that they've passed so far. So we in Congress, I have my own priorities right now. I serve on the Appropriations Committee. I serve on the Budget Committee. In the Appropriations Committee, I think it's important that we actually pass our appropriations bill and that we don't shut down the government, obviously. But a whole other issue is the debt ceiling, right? You guys keep hearing about the debt ceiling. And Republicans are threatening to hold it hostage if we don't make drastic cuts to things like food and nutrition programs for young kids who can't afford to eat. Things like medical care for seniors, things like medical care for everybody. It's just absolutely insane. They want to make these drastic cuts. They're holding our economy hostage. So we need to make sure that they don't do that. That's something we're working on now. For me personally, I have several issues that I really feel strongly about. The legislation I'll be introducing later this week and later this month. I've got one bill to create a national program to combat domestic violence. Something that's very important for me for my time as a prosecutor. I served a long time doing a lot of domestic violence cases, everything. I ended up prosecuting everything from traffic tickets to first-degree murder. I spent a long time in domestic violence cases. There's a lot of things that you can do to prevent it and also to break this cycle. One thing that happens in domestic violence cases is you end up with multiple generations engaging in it and thinking that sort of thing is normal. So you can break the cycle, but you need to have resources in order to be able to do it. That's something I'm working on now and something I hope to be able to do at a national level. I have a bipartisan bill to do that. Another thing I've been working on is trying to stop the import into the U.S. of goods made with forced labor from the Uyghur region, from the Xinjiang Autonomous Region in China. This is something where the PRC has put people they're committing genocide, basically, it's been found. Putting people into these concentration camps, forcing them to work, forcing them to perform cheap labor, people sell their goods at a very cheap price all around the world. So if you ever actually shop at Shein, fast casual, well, that's a big culprit of this, is my impression. It's alleged that they're big culprits, that they're engaging in this kind of behavior, that they're taking advantage of it, and that they're selling these goods that are made with slave labor. So keep that in mind next time you want to buy something fashionable that's pretty much disposable. Another thing I'm working on is something that came from me from a constituent, which is the Gabriella Miller Kids First Act 2.0. I discovered that kids' cancer doesn't get the same treatment that adults' cancers do. The government only pays a fraction of what we pay for adult cancers for research into those cancers. And some of them are really curable, but it's really sad these kids are still having to take medicines that were created 60, 70 years ago. One young woman told me about how she had to take a medicine that was derived from mustard gas, which is, of course, a chemical weapon, right? So, when she would take her medicine, the people who would administer her had to wear these hazmat suits, which shouldn't be happening in this country. There's things we can do so much better. We've made a bunch of breakthroughs to make sure that program gets reauthorized and funded. Those are things I'm working on personally. Another thing I'm working on personally is, you may have seen that I've been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This is a recent thing for me. It's really hard for me to deal with it, but I'm working on it. I'm trying to turn it around and turn it into something positive. I'm trying to use my position it's early onset. I feel like I'm far too young for this. I'm far too young and vivacious to have Parkinson's disease, quite frankly. But I'm trying to turn it around and do some good with it. I feel that about the 90,000 people who are diagnosed every year, I feel like I can actually do something about it. So I'm going to try to get some more resources to it and help direct resources to finding a cure. So that's the new mission that I have in Congress. I hope to be able to find some success with that, and that's what I'm going to be working on in 2019. Thank you. And before we move on, that's one of the reasons I talk fast. It's one of the things. I'm trying to slow down, I really am, but I'm working on getting some speech therapy. But please bear with me in the meantime, okay? Thanks.
Thank you so much, both of you.
I'm from Boston, and I've been accused of talking
Yeah.
fast, too.
Politicians usually are fast talkers, but my reason.
So thank you again so much for sharing your experiences.
You're going to have to speak up.
Thank you again both for sharing your experiences and your priorities for the 118th Congress. We will start with our first question that is pre-submitted, and then if the audience would like, you can line up at that mic over there to ask your further questions. Our first question is, from your time in politics, what do you think are the drivers of the heavy partisan divide we see in government today? And how can we as students ameliorate that?
What are the drivers of what?
of heavy partisan divide and polarization? And what can we as students do to improve that?
I think we can't be naive about, if I have a town hall meeting and I ask my citizens, how many of you want us to just get along and stop fighting and get things done and try to get along? All the hands go up. And then I say, well, you're all going to be disappointed, because that's not how it works. Our politics have become very brittle in America. The divide between us has grown. I can remember when the Republicans were talking about cutting the Affordable Care Act, and one of their amendments would cut 25 million people from health insurance. Well, what was the Democratic compromise there? Was I supposed to agree to 10 million? I was going to do 0. There is no compromise in something like that. When the Supreme Court overrules Roe v. Wade, the gap between the two parties is unbridgeable. Generally, my party believes, and I certainly believe, it's about a woman's right to choose. It's about her control over her body. It's not about politicians interfering with that. And that America is all about expanding rights, not contracting them, certainly not taking them away once affirmed. And if you read Judge Alito's opinion in Dobbs, to people like me, it's actually appalling. It's just appalling in the primitive logic he applies. And I'll give you one small example of the contradiction of people like him. So he asserts there is no constitutional right to an abortion because the Constitution doesn't mention abortion at all. Well, there's a lot of stuff the Constitution doesn't mention. And I'll give you one. You know what the Constitution doesn't mention? It never mentions, never, that the Supreme Court has the right to review and overturn legislation passed by the Congress. That right never was enshrined in the Constitution. It was asserted by John Marshall in 1804 in Marbury v. Madison. And it wasn't used. The first time the Supreme Court ever reviewed legislation and overturned it was in a famous and really reprehensible case, Dred Scott, in 1857. How'd that work out for us? So, Judge Alito, if you really want to make the point that unless it's in the Constitution, it doesn't count, let's start with you, because you don't have any role, if you're going to follow that logic, in reviewing legislation Jennifer and I pass and opining about it. So, partisan polarization is real, and we cannot pretend it doesn't exist. And it exists for a reason, because we fundamentally disagree about lots of issues, big ones. That doesn't mean we don't find common ground on other issues, and we do. I've introduced, in the last Congress, I was ranked #1 in terms of most effective legislator. Every bill I introduced, I had a Republican co-sponsor. I went out of my way to make sure I got one. Every bill I passed had bipartisan support. But on the big issues, immigration, abortion, even the debt ceiling that we're now debating right now, the gap grows wider. And I just think we can't pretend that's not true. And I think we also have to understand that bipartisanship is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. For example, I was proud to vote for the Affordable Care Act in 2010. At the time, very controversial. Not a single Republican voted for it. Should I have withheld my support because there was no Republican bipartisan support? Well, 13 years later, boy, am I glad we passed that bill. And I hope most of you are as well. Millions of Americans now have access to health insurance. Millions of Americans who have a pre-existing health condition are going to remain insured because we made it illegal to deny people coverage because they had a pre-existing health condition. We closed the donut hole for senior citizens and prescription drugs, and lots of other reforms protecting consumers. making healthcare more universally available, and hopefully over time, affordable. That was a good thing to do. It was not bipartisan. In fact, quite the opposite. For years, Republicans attempted to repeal it. So we try to look for opportunities to collaborate and cooperate. But we have to be realistic about values and what we're fighting for. And I don't have any common ground with somebody who votes to overturn a free and fair election after a 6-hour insurrection in the Capitol.
The Constitution also doesn't say that corporations are people, but Alito had no problem saying that, right? And that has pretty much ended democracy as we know it with all the big money and dark money in politics. Another thing that has caused this tribalism is the fact that we all live in our news silos, right? There's MSNBC and there's Fox News, but there's not just Fox News. There's Newsmax, there's OAN, there's all these networks that are just absolutely right-wing nuts, and they just believe everything that they hear on there. It makes it really hard to be able to reason with these people when their base is not going to let them, not to let them step outside the lines, right? So another thing that has happened is gerrymandering. So many districts have become so gerrymandered that elections don't really matter in them. It's all about the primary. It's all about the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. Now, the other thing about Republicans I've noticed, at least congressional Republicans, is that they don't really have a governance. They don't really want to govern. They want to throw bombs when they're in the minority, but once they're actually in charge, they have no interest other than owning the libs, right? That's all they want to do, own the libs. So they're all about passing this stuff that's like the parental, the parents' rights, protecting women and girls' sports from dangerous people or something. I can't remember what they called it, but it was something prohibiting schools from even letting trans kids play on the teams that they identify with. It's absolutely insane what they're trying to do. So it seems like one party is really interested in power for power's sake. The other party is interested in governing. And it makes it hard for us to really come together. As Jerry said, though, there are areas where we come together. Very pleased we're able to do that on some things, and things involving a lot of foreign policy issues, because I think at the river's edge or the water's edge, that's where we really make the difference. That's where for foreign policy we're able to find a lot of bipartisan cooperation. That on Ukraine we have continued to be bipartisan and strong in our support of that country, and their war against Russian aggression. So I hope that continues under this new majority. But it's difficult to find areas of cooperation, places where we get along. I find that for me, some of it happens in the criminal justice area. Things like making sure that we have access to things like more resources for victims of domestic violence and stuff like that. So I'm trying to do is find areas where we can get along, but in the areas where we can't, I'm just still going to fight for my values and the values of my constituents.
If I could add one more thing to that, one way of looking at this from a political science point of view is all politicians at a certain level are Pavlovian. What is rewarded, what is punished? And I can tell you that bipartisanship is not rewarded. Because if you are seen as too cooperative with the other side, you're going to face a challenge in your next primary. And that's true on the Republican side, and it's true on the Democratic side. So our own base voters want to see, assertion. They want to see values championed and enshrined. They don't necessarily want to see compromise that waters down or dilutes those values. You also have created an environment in Washington that didn't exist, say, 40, 50 years ago, where you've got all of these outside partisan political groups. Now, they thrive on membership. They thrive on people either donating or paying dues, and you don't motivate people to join those kinds of organizations by saying, hey, we solved another problem on a bipartisan basis. That is not what those members want to hear. They want to hear you are perpetuating the fight, you're taking the fight to the other side, you're demonizing them, and you're just never giving up. So there's a whole environment we've created, unfortunately, in our politics that thrives on and, in fact, succeeds only if problems do not get resolved. They're perpetual, because that's how my membership goes up every year, and my revenue goes up every year, and we're fighting the good fight on your behalf. And as Jennifer said, you can see that in even some of our media outlets like Fox. So remember that reward-punishment thing. Until we can change our polity in America, where we start rewarding people who say, no, compromise is not a bad thing, it's a good thing, and I am going to try to collaborate, and I'm going to have something to show for it that you're going to benefit from, and I'm going to reward my partner on the other side who's willing to collaborate with me. Until we change that calibration, our politics are going to remain very, very polarized and very partisan.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on one of the points that Congresswoman Wexton made on campaign finance reform. Wealthy corporations are able to spend massive amounts of money and resources on political expenditures due to the 2010 Citizens United case. Do you support campaign finance reform? If so, what actions need to be taken, and if not, why?
Absolutely, I support campaign finance reform. I think that the United decision was one of the worst things that happened to our country, truly. I mean, we've got these big dark money groups getting millions and billions of dollars funneled to them by billionaires that don't have to disclose who they are, right? So we don't have any idea where the money's even coming from. And so that's absurd. These people can come in and win elections. They can come in and engage in advertising that's false or misleading, and they do. They're going to keep doing it until they get stopped. And unfortunately, with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So we need to at least require them to disclose who their donors are, so people can vet them and find out what their backgrounds are, know exactly what it is that they're trying to push, what their agenda is that they're trying to push. Because it's absurd that there's no disclosure about any of that. Because for us in the Congress, we have limits for our donations. Individuals can only give a certain amount of money each cycle. In Virginia, though, in the state they have full disclosure, but there's no limit to the amount people can give. So certain donors we're going to give people hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to run for office, and it's absurd that they're doing that as well. I'd like to see some limits at the state levels. I'd like to see some more limits at the federal levels. I'd like to see disclosure of the dark money. I would like to see it end entirely. But I just think it would be good if we could see some improvements in what we got where we're stuck with the Constitution the way it is at the moment.
I fully support campaign finance reform and have supported a constitutional amendment to that effect. Mm-hmm. But I think you should look, again, we talked about the Supreme Court, to show you how we have a Supreme Court that is run amok. Unfortunately, we've named a law school here at George Mason University after one of the justices who was leading the band. In Citizens United, just to show you the illogic behind that decision. So if you want to support Jennifer for Congress, you are limited by law to giving her, I'll use the old number, it's been updated this year by a few $100s. So in the last cycle, you could give her $2,800 for her primary and another $2,800 for the general, for a total of $5,600. That's the most you can give her by law. If you give her any more than that, you have violated the law. And if she accepts it knowingly, she's violated the law. But if you're a wealthy person under Citizens United, you can go out and form a super PAC all by yourself. And you can put $28 million in it, $280 million in it if you want. And that PAC can be devoted solely to reelecting Jennifer. So you're not limited in the PAC donations you make by the individual donation the rest of us mere mortals are limited by. That's crazy. That was the logic behind Citizens United. It opened the floodgates to dark money. And many of these organizations never have to disclose where they're being funded. And it seems to me in a democracy, sunshine is a wonderful disinfectant. Here in Virginia, we have unlimited, at the state level, as Jennifer said, we have unlimited donations, but we do have disclosure requirements that are fairly tough. And at least then you know who's giving to whom, and you can decide whether they have something by way of motivation or not. But at the federal level, because of that decision, deciding corporations are persons too, which is crazy, and that they and dark money donors are free to flood our politics with money that you can't trace, that circumvents the limit, the original limit in the McCain-Feingold legislation, has really done enormous damage to our politics. And that was the Supreme Court.
One thing I would advise you to do when you see these political commercials, look for who sponsored them at the end of them. It'll say, sponsored by New America Foundation, or sponsored by Concerned Citizens for the Climate, or sponsored by Concerned Citizens for America's Future, whatever it is. And then look them up. Try and learn what you can about them. You'll find out that there's very little you'll actually find out about them. You'll get sent to some website that talks about all the basic issues that they're interested in, whatever it may be, in very general terms, nothing specific, nothing about where their money comes from or anything like that. So it's pretty wild that they can spend all this money and not give you any actual information about what their real agenda is.
Thank you. Our next question concerns education. The rising cost of higher education is a significant issue that many students must consider when choosing a college that is affordable. What do you think the role of the federal government has been in the increasingly expensive cost of higher education?
Well, I mean, the federal government plays a role in providing for backup financing for student loans. And of course, there's the Pell Grant program that has made higher education affordable for a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't access it. The role of federal government in education really got its big start with the GI Bill of Rights after World War II, which allowed all kinds of people suddenly to access college education that had not happened before. And the federal government is still evolving in terms of its role in education. I think higher education has to come to grips with the costs that are being imposed on students. If you talk to realtors, many of them will say that, like your generation, the biggest impediment when you get out of school and start working to home ownership is this huge overhang of debt from financing college. And frankly, previous generations did not have that challenge. I mean, college cost money, but it wasn't something that was going to stay with you for the rest of your life. And it wasn't in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. My daughter went to UVA. She spent 4 years undergrad at UVA and got her master's at the Batten School for 1 more year, so 5 years. And one day my staff came to see me and said, "You're #1 in Congress in terms of the student debt you've got." I thought, student debt? I paid off my student debt a long time ago. And it turned out my daughter's at a public university like you are in Virginia. She's a Virginia resident, and we had hoped that a public university in Virginia would be an affordable education and a good one. But it was a lot less affordable than we thought. And I can only imagine when I talk to people who decide their kids decide they're going to go to a private university, especially if it's Ivy League, they're looking at horrific numbers. And so we have to do something about the cost of education. I certainly support the idea, for example, of free community college. So people get a start. Maybe that's where they end, but here in Virginia, we have a deal that if you successfully maintain grades and you complete 2 years of community college, you're automatically accepted into one of our public universities. And we have a great public university system in Virginia. So looking at models like that, I think, really make a lot of sense. But we also need universities to show some restraint in the costs that they impose on their students.
So I am entirely a product of public education from grade school through grad school. I went to college at the University of Maryland, and I went to law school at William & Mary. So for me, I was able to, I graduated from law school with $30,000 in debt, which is pretty amazing nowadays, right? I mean, this is, it's over 20 years ago, but it's pretty amazing to graduate with such a little debt. So for me, it's always been about going to the right college for you. And one of the things that I think we can do at the federal level is we can do things like ensure that people have access to Pell Grants and stuff like that. You can use Pell Grants not just for four-year degrees, but also for things like associate degrees or for career certificate training courses, which they can't now use them for. It would be very, very helpful for them, because not everybody's going to want to go to a four-year university, right? Not everybody needs to go to a four-year university. It would be something that would be very helpful for a lot of people, and that's something we can do at the federal level that we've been trying to do for years. It's been blocked by the other side of the aisle for quite a while. So one of the things we can also do is just keep this in mind when we're negotiating with these colleges over things. Whereas in the General Assembly, they wanted to increase their tuition by a bunch, and we've made some. One of the issues that happened with us in Virginia is that there was a significant underinvestment in our universities during the Great Recession. From 2008 on, we gave them almost no money, and they really did need to raise tuition in order to be able to continue to educate our kids. But now, but then they didn't reinvest it once they got the money back. We have places like UVA that have billion-dollar endowments, but don't actually give any of that to the people who need it. It makes it really hard for them to come to us with a straight face and say we need to increase our tuition 8% next year. So it makes it really challenging for us. But one of the things I think at the federal level, one of the issues I've heard talked about is that because federal student aid is so easy to get, it's driven up the cost of college, right? The colleges know that people are going to be able to get this aid, and they'll drive up their tuition costs accordingly. I'm not that cynical, but I would like to see some studies of it to see what the actual cost of that is and where that's coming from. Because if that's true, that's something we need to make sure that they've stopped, because it's not fair to our kids. I do think that unfortunately, or fortunately rather, our community college system is one of the best bargains out there, and it's a great, great system we have here in Northern Virginia. We're very, very fortunate. So going to 2 years of community college, which I would think should be free, followed by the 2 years of undergrad, a great way to make a good degree and hopefully not to graduate without debt. Something I would recommend for everybody.
Especially here we are at George Mason University, the largest public university in Virginia.
Which is the best bargain in Virginia, by the way.
What's that?
Best public school bargain in Virginia.
Yeah. And we have, if you look at what the state, I don't know what it is now, but the state financial participation in this university is very small. And yet Virginia claims it is a state university and the governor appoints a board of governors. Now, one of the reasons for that, and Jennifer remembers this from her days in the state senate, is when conservatives really dominated state government, they loved the fact that we were almost a pay-as-you-go state. We had very little debt, even though we had a AAA bond rating with lots of debt capacity allowed for us. And they took great pride in that. But what it did was it forced universities to look at other revenue sources to make a go of it. Now, the state's done a pretty good job, as you can see, in investing in capital. But all of that has to be lobbied. But in terms of basic support for the running of the state university system, the state is way behind what it ought to be doing. And we ought to be looking at making major investments at the state level to preserve and to enhance what is truly the jewel in the crown of Virginia, which is a top-notch, high-performing state university system. But California is a good example of what can happen when you disinvest, when you stop those investments. You lose that edge. So we don't want to do that, and that can also help with the affordability of education. If the state does more of what I think ought to be its fair share, if you want to call something a state university.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, which will be about...
We're just getting started here.
Unfortunately, we only have until 10 today, but thank you. So the next question will be about the environment. So the science is clear and action must be taken. How do you support advancing climate policy to mitigate climate change and build resiliency in our communities? What role do you see students and young voices taking in the fight against climate change?
This is the number one issue I hear from young people when I'm out talking to them, because you guys are the ones who are going to be dealing with it for the future much more than we are. So one of the things that we've done in Congress, I'm very proud of what we did with the Inflation Reduction Act, which made historic investments in renewables, in green energy, things like that, which are going to really go a long way to help cut our carbon footprint. There's so much more that we can do. We need to cut the subsidies to the oil and gas industry, right? There's no reason we should be subsidizing them. They made record profits over the past few years and making billions of dollars. They don't need our help. There's a lot more that we can do also with little things, with winterizing and weatherizing. Efficiency is a big deal as well, trying to work on that, because that's something that a lot of people, that's a lot of lost energy right there through efficiency. So things like that are things that we can do. Also working on breakthroughs in things like hydrogen science. I mean, things like that, which will also cut our carbon footprint quite a bit over the next 20 years. The Biden administration has a new rule which is coming out, which is going to be about power plants and how much energy how much carbon they can produce. Make a huge difference in terms of their overall carbon production. There's no question that there will be litigation about it. We'll see what happens with it. I know that when Obama tried the Clean Power Plan, he had to go through the litigation as well. Hopefully this iteration of it will withstand this constitutional scrutiny, end up becoming law.
One of the problems with discussing global climate change and global warming is that we're very good at describing the problem, and in the process, we end up discouraging people from believing there's anything they can do about it. I don't know if you remember, Al Gore's award-winning film, which is excellent in laying out the problem. And at one point, he gets on a platform because the CO2 emissions are so high, he can't reach them. And you're looking at that as a viewer, and you're thinking, oh my God, yeah, he's right. But boy, I can't. What can I do? And I think that's a disservice. I think persuading people there's nothing they can do is not helpful. There are lots of things we can do at a micro level that cumulatively add up to a macro level. The world came together in the Paris Climate Accord, and it was another shameful moment for Donald Trump when he pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. Every nation in the world, except us and Nicaragua, was a member of the Paris Climate Accord, where we collectively at least agreed, yes, there's a problem, and here are some goals we're setting for ourselves, and now we need implementation plans to make that happen. The evidence of and we talked about bipartisanship and partisanship. Here's another example where the cleavage between the two parties is enormous. We're still dealing with people, friends of ours on the other side of the aisle, who don't want to acknowledge explicitly that global climate change is in fact real. Or if it is, it's not man-made. It's not we don't really have anything to do with it. It's just a natural cycle. Well, all the evidence is the rapidity of global climate change and its ramifications is very real, and it is directly related to human activity since the Industrial Revolution, but accelerated in today's world. And therefore, there are things we can do to reverse it. And the good news is there are lots of exciting technologies that can help us do that. We're rapidly moving, for example, to the electrification of our cars, our trucks. Jennifer and I can do something about that, right? In setting standards, in encouraging the automotive manufacturers to accelerate that move, in providing tax credits for citizens, and even in relatively small but targeted ways. So, for example, I've worked in postal reform. Well, the second largest vehicular fleet in America is the postal fleet. They have 235,000 vehicles. The average age of those vehicles that you see driving around, well, maybe you don't see them at George Mason, but we see them in our neighborhoods, postal vehicles, is 25 to 30 years. What could go wrong with a 25 or 30-year-old vehicle? They're gas guzzlers, they're polluters, they break down, they require a lot of maintenance. Replacing them with electric vehicles, especially in short runs, really makes sense. So we have an opportunity to kind of jumpstart an investment in electric vehicles by targeting that fleet. And we're doing that. and we're doing that. The good news is the postal system has agreed, reluctantly, but it's now agreed, to roughly 75% of the vehicles it's going to be purchasing will in fact be electric or hybrid. That's good news for the environment. And it's also good news for sort of jump-starting the electric market. We can do the same with other renewables, solar and wind and geothermal and other kinds of technologies to significantly reduce one of the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which is the generation of power. And we're looking at cutting-edge technologies that may allow us to go much further. We're looking at technologies, and again, we get to help make decisions about investing in research and development in some of these new technologies, including carbon consumption. Can we reverse it? Can we create technologies that actually consume carbon, CO2, so that instead of going up to the atmosphere, we're consuming it? That would actually reverse emissions. And we're that close to to technologies that could allow us to mass produce that and make a cumulative difference. So I think we need to talk more positively about what we can do and that we need to do it, as opposed to scaring people to death and persuading them that there's nothing they can do. I know that's no one's intention, but I do think that that's one of the effects we have. So one of the things we do as legislators is look for where can we have an impact? Where can we make a difference? How can we set the stage for a more comprehensive approach to global warming that will be efficacious, that will make a difference?
Thank you both so much for your time and for addressing the questions from the community here today. It is Students on Air's goal that by bringing together information, citizens, and their representatives, together we can foster democracy and find common ground on key issues to deliver better solutions for our community. Thank you, everyone, once again for coming here today.
Can I just say something? I just see the former rector of this university, Tom Davis. Tom Davis had my job in Congress. And if you want an example of bipartisan cooperation, Tom, when I won his seat, he was retiring, I took over his seat, we completely collaborated on the transition. Tom put my campaign manager, who became my chief of staff, on his payroll so I would have access before I was sworn in to Capitol Hill. I kept several of Tom's staff members on my payroll when I became congressman because they had been doing good work in terms of constituents. And we've cooperated ever since. And that was a model that is available if people really want to do it, because both Tom and I were committed to the people we serve here, and that whatever differences we had to overlook for the sake of the people he served and that I now serve. So I want to salute Tom for being that kind of person and a model for bipartisan cooperation.
Hey, Tom.
Thank you, Congressman Connolly, for sharing that great example of bipartisanship. And thank you, everyone, once again for coming here. Our next town hall will be with former Representative Davis and will begin in a few minutes. In the meantime, please visit our roundtable discussions in the back ballroom and meet with staff members from other Northern Virginian politicians. Thank you.
Good job.
Hello, hello. So I would just like to introduce former Fairfax Board of Supervisor member, former congressional representative, former chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee, House Oversight Committee, and chairman Tom Davis. Actually, like Jerry Connolly said, he had the same district, Virginia District 11. He didn't even lose it. He chose to resign. And in each of his elections, he won by either, except for his inaugural election, he won by either 60% or 80%. Until he chose to resign in 2007. So I think I'd like to begin there in this sort of bipartisanship that you maintained, even though you had a really strong hold on your district. You know, I'd like to ask, why do you think Democrats never really chose to run candidates against you?
Well, they did. I mean, my first race was for county supervisor in a heavily Democratic district. I got 63%. So they came after me the next time hard, and I got 78%. I mean, the reality is they couldn't beat me. So when you get into that situation, upcoming politicians decide to go somewhere else. What Jerry didn't tell you, and Jerry and I we call frenemies, but we've been good friends. We've always got along and understood the boundaries. At one point, at several points, contemplated running against me. He moved to a different district for supervisor and ran in Providence. I stayed close to the ground, close to my constituents, and my elections were basically non-events. And I could have stayed, but why would you stay in this environment when you can go out and make millions of dollars doing something else? So, as I said, I left undefeated and unindicted. And I just add my first House race, I beat a Democratic incumbent. I only beat her by 9 points. But my Senate candidate lost the district. I ran 25 points ahead of our Senate candidate, Oliver North, who was running a close race nationally, but in my district was radioactive. I always said when Oliver North came to Fairfax, you couldn't find me with a search warrant, but it was just one of those things. So that's why. So
when you entered Congress, you came in a big Republican wave, and then you stayed for 12 years, and you decided to leave almost right when the Democrats were taking over. What was your did you see the writing on the wall? Did you just have enough of Congress? Why'd you decide to leave?
So 94 was a Democratic. It was a Republican wave here, except in Northern Virginia, where our congressional candidates did far worse than they had in 92. Again, because Oliver North was at the top of the ticket, and Oliver North was probably less popular up here than Donald Trump is today. If that gives you a sense. So having to run in that environment was tough, and I won that and won it by 9. Now, I won it with unanimous support from the business community, the endorsement of the Washington Post. I had a lot of good things going for me against a Democratic incumbent that had drawn the district for herself. And I'd been chairman of the county board in Fairfax, which gave me a good political base. I'd been elected chairman against a Democratic incumbent. I won that race 2-1, 66-34. Was the percentage point. So Fairfax voters were very good to me. I like to think I was good to them. But I was a subcommittee chairman in my first term in the House for the DC subcommittee, which is, it sounds impressive to say as a freshman you're a subcommittee chairman. DC subcommittee is probably the least sought after subcommittee in the House. But it worked for me because a lot of my constituents worked in DC. The city was they'd lost their bond rating, they were in a financial free fall, and it fell to me as the subcommittee chairman to write a control board bill, which I worked with the Clinton administration and Eleanor Holmes Norton and others to write, and I introduced it and passed it and had it signed into law in 9 days. And that kind of solidified my stature. I went on to become chairman of the Republican Campaign Committee. That hurt me a little bit in this district because it was a Democratic district. because I didn't have a partisan thing, but I chaired the campaign committee twice successfully, increasing our margins in the House, and moved that. My choice then was to go into the Republican leadership as a whip, majority, one of those spots, or to go and be a committee chairman. And my district was moving left, the party was moving right, and I said, if I want to stick around, I need to be a committee chairman. So I was chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, wrote a lot of law there, did a lot of investigations. Any baseball fans out here? I did the steroid hearings. I chaired the steroid hearings, wrote the subpoenas there. But in the Republican side, after 3 terms as chairman, you have to give up the gavel. And rather than go to rotate to being a backbencher and giving up the gavel, I knew I could make a lot of money outside of Congress. I actually was making less money as a member of Congress than I had before I went into Congress, because aside from being chairman of the county board and a county supervisor, I've been general counsel to a public company, which was a lucrative business, but politics was kind of my sidelight at that point. So that's why I left. I was termed out as a committee chairman. I knew I suffered from a disease many of your parents have called maltuition. You ever heard of that? Maltuition, you got to pay for your kids' college tuition. Jean Marie and I had 4 kids in college at the same time. We had 2 at Swarthmore, 1 at UVA, and 1 at William & Mary. So we got, you had to pay the bill somewhere. Just time in our life where we said, let's move on from politics. Also, I was getting a little less comfortable in my own caucus. I knew I didn't belong in the Democratic caucus. That was a non-starter for me. But Republicans were getting they were getting off on some of these social issues and stuff where I was a little less comfortable. My economics are very solidly conservative. And so I looked around and said, what am I doing here? Let's go out and have a life, and it's been a successful life.
So actually that moves pretty well into my next question is, do you think you could be the same kind of politician you were back in the mid-90s, early 2000s if you were still in office today?
Well, I'm going to always be who I am. The question is, do I fit the times? 3 macro factors have occurred just in that time since I left. It was starting to come before that have really polarized politics. Political science, we call it, and if you take my classes here, we call it the ideological sorting of the parties. When I came in, we had a lot of moderate and even liberal Republicans. We had a lot of conservative Democrats. The parties, they were strong parties, but they weren't sorted around ideology. So you had Republicans in the Northeast, Democrats in the South. The Voting Rights Act basically was a contributor to this, because when you start packing minorities, you end up bleaching the districts around it. And so the end result is, in the Deep South today, in the House, all we have are white Republicans and black Democrats. And by the way, no need to talk to the other side because they play no role in the nomination process. So 3 things have happened. Number 1 is 80% of the House and 75% of the Senate, the only race that matters is the primary election. So they hew their time, their attention, and their voting records to their primary voters. Jerry and I were just talking about this. By the way, Jerry Connolly and I are a bit, as I said, we've clashed. My wife ran against him twice for supervisor before she went to the State House and State Senate. But when I decided not to run again, Jerry was the first call I made. I said, Jerry, in 2 months I'm going to announce I'm not running again. You need to be ready, because I knew he'd always wanted it. He's a very competent guy. We had our disagreements, but we also had a détente on certain issues, and I knew he'd be a good representative for the people here, for the issues that are important to this region. But 80% of the House, think of it, the only race they care about is the primary. So they worry about their primary voters. They don't worry about independents. They don't worry about the other party. And primary voters are not a representative group in the electorate. They tend to be pretty ideologically oriented. They tend to be less forgiving of compromise. They don't reward compromise. They tend to punish it. In these districts, basically, November is nothing more than a constitutional formality. Number 2 is the way people receive their news. When I grew up, we had 3 major news stations. The news was vetted. It was factual. You might not like what you heard, but everybody dealt with the same level of information. Today, not true. Everybody's walking around their own bubble. We have a saying today that people don't tune in for information. They tune in for affirmation. The people tune into the news that they get to hear the news that reaffirms their worldviews. It started in 1986 when the Federal Communications Commission did away with something called the Fairness Doctrine. Fairness Doctrine basically was an equal time. If you showed one side, you had to show the other. They did away with that, and some radio station owners said, hey, we don't have to show both sides anymore. And talk radio sprang up. Rush Limbaugh, Rachel Maddow, they were products of talk radio. People would tune in every day and get the news that they wanted to hear, get juiced up on what they wanted to hear. It was replicated then on cable television when Fox News decided, a lot of conservatives don't like what they're hearing from mainstream. We're going to carve our niche with the fair and balanced news, as they called it. And they started, and it was a very successful movement. And their viewership and the money's coming in. This is a business model. I don't consider this news in the traditional sense. It's an entertainment business model. And then MSNBC said, hey, it's working on the left, on the right, let's do it on the left. And MSNBC grew up, and then CNN kind of was getting squeezed. Trump comes around, they decided, well, we're going to be an anti-Trump channel too. And if you ever watch MSNBC and Fox on the same night, anybody ever do that? I mean, they're different planets. They're playing two different audiences. With the State of the Union this year, I missed the State of the Union, but I tuned in afterwards, and I tuned into Fox. I heard it was a terrible speech. I turned to MSNBC, and it was the Gettysburg Address. I mean, they're going to feed you what you want to hear every night. You got to take it with a grain of salt. You got to recognize what's going on. All we heard from mainstream was Trump collusion with the Russians, and then the investigation. Voila, it wasn't there. They couldn't connect it. Same with Hunter Biden on the left. We know what's happened with Fox. We've just seen the lawsuit brought by Dominion, that they were manipulating this to keep their viewership in line. So when you watch these channels, just be careful. I tell my students, tune into the other side. Hear what the other side is saying, because we all view life through different lenses. We have different perspectives. We have different worldviews. A good political leader listens to everybody and understands it. Why was I successful? I was successful because I went out and talked to everybody. I was the only Republican member who did an anti-war town meeting. The anti-war groups came in, and of course members avoided it. And I walk in, and there are hundreds of people, TV cameras, everything else, and I just spent an hour getting pummeled. But you want to go out and face it. It's important to hear what other people are saying that you ordinarily wouldn't run into. It makes you better. My committee was successful because my ranking Democrat was a guy named Henry Waxman. Henry was a very liberal Democrat from California, and we ran the committee in toto. We worked it together. He knew what I was going to do. There were no surprises. We certainly had our disagreements, but we recognized that we needed to run a smooth committee. So instead of staying up all night with nuisance amendments and the like, we knew what amendments I could accept, what I couldn't accept, where we'd have the fight. But it was very harmonious. And members all of a sudden wanted to be on the committee again because we weren't fighting all the time. And investigations are hard because one group is attacking the other side's quarterback and the other one's defending it. But Henry and I worked out a rhythm. There's a rhythm to governing that you have to work out. When I was chairman of the county board, at a tough time, I had a 6-4 Republican majority who got swept in on my coattails. All of my budgets were 10-0 votes, and those are the most contentious sometimes. Some of the things, not everything was 10-0, but most of the stuff, we'd sit around the table, figure out what we could do, and we'd move on. That doesn't happen today because you worry not about the electorate in general, you worry about what do your primary voters think. And it's been very destructive. The third factor is where's the money in politics gone? And Congress passed a law, it's called McCain-Feingold. I was a floor manager against the bill, I'll just tell you. The idea was good. It's going to get this evil soft money out of politics and that's influencing politicians. But as I said in my floor speech, well, where do you think this money's going to go? You think this money's going to disappear? Basically, all McCain-Feingold did is it took the money away from 6 committees, the Republican and Democratic House Campaign Committee, Senate Campaign Committee, and National Committees. But that money didn't disappear with the help of a couple Supreme Court cases. Speech Now, a D.C. Circuit Court decision, and Citizens United from the Supreme Court. That money's come back now flowing in super PACs and everything else. It's made the whole thing almost ridiculous, and it's empowered interest groups like never before. So those 3 factors, single-party districts, the way people receive their news, and now the way the money is distributed. The parties have been a centering force in American politics for 200 years. You take that money away from here, and you move it out to the wings, what do you expect? The districts have gone from centered competitive districts out to here. The way people receive their information, their news, has gone from vetted, factual news out to here because of the business models. And the money has gone from the parties, a centering force in American politics for 200 years, out to. So what do you expect? And voila, this is the conundrum we find ourselves in. And people walk around, I'm right and you're wrong because of the information they receive. Let me tell you, nobody's got a monopoly on truth. And we can see this from the way the media's covered this and how many times they've been wrong. People are very suspicious. And by the way, Fox and MSNBC are more centered now than some of these other channels out on the right and the left. Fox has Newsmax coming right up after them and you could see this in some of the emails in this Dominion suit, that if they didn't feed this, their viewers may go somewhere else, which means you lose ad revenue and the like. And that's where we are. So could I survive in that environment? I try to. But you got to always have to worry about your primary. My voters tolerated me. I wasn't 100% Republican, but they tolerated me because they knew I could hold the seat. And I was at least a vote for organization. And on economic issues, I was absolutely solid. But when it came to things like assault weapons ban, stem cell research, voting rights for D.C., not so much. But that's, I think that fit the district. And I just had to work extra hard to keep my party happy. I bought the Republican Party of Fairfax, I bought them their headquarters. I paid $600,000 out of my campaign, bought them a headquarters, and 2 weeks later they passed a resolution censoring me for sponsoring District of Columbia voting rights. So it's a tough business out there, and you just got to smile and move on.
I guess, yeah, sort of in that spirit of listening to other people, does anyone have any questions for the former congressman before I ask any of my other questions?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, if you could ask your question.
Into the microphone, of course.
Yes.
Good morning, my name's Erica Munisar, and I'm with the Fourth Estate School newspaper at GMU. We represent 40,000 students, and I liked your comments about the media. I assume you're trying to lower polarization, and I wanted to hear directly from you, what is one piece of advice you would like to give to the media today to, improve the political sphere?
Well, I do think that a lot of people that go into this kind of we all have our own biases. There's nothing, in every profession. But I think a lot of the people that choose this have their own biases, right or left, and they tend to get itself into the stories. Where you see this a lot, so you've got, I talked about cable news and radio, but even newspapers. You have the Wall Street Journal, which is a solid paper, solid Ivy League writers and everything else, and the New York Times, and yet they're very different. My next door neighbor who voted for Trump, I was asking him, he's from New York. He no longer gets the New York Times. He gets the Wall Street Journal because that feeds him what he wants to hear. You go into the Republican cloakroom, you can't get a Washington Post in the House now. I was there the other day. They have the Washington Times. You go to the Democratic cloakroom, you couldn't find a Washington Times or a Wall Street Journal. So people just feed on what they want, and you just like to have some press. People, when they write it, you can swear by it. And we don't seem to get that anymore. So kind of put your biases aside, talk to everybody, and then do the best you can. You'll never hide your biases completely, but I think that's important. I just say one other thing on the student thing. When I was rector, one of the things I did for graduation speakers is we had our 2 student members of the board, which are non-voting members, but we would always run graduation speakers, get their suggestions, and they came up with some people that I wouldn't have picked, but we tried to accommodate that because, and vice versa, is you try to be inclusive in your decision making, which means you may not win every battle, but you're part of the discussion and you're more likely to win the next time. I just think we see so little of that. I don't know, I haven't read the Fourth Estate lately. I'm sorry to say, I don't get the online version or anything, but it's just important sometimes that you allow contrary views up there to be heard because they're not always wrong, and if everybody had the same views, none of the changes that many of you have embraced would have ever occurred. So it's just really important to keep your ear open, your eyes open, and hear from contrasting views.
Excellent. Anyone else? No? All right. Okay.
Well, let me address something that Jerry Connolly did before on that's climate change, because I know that's on everybody's mind. I think one of the biggest issues on climate change is when you start the discussion as one presidential candidate said, we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work. What do you think that does, if you represent West Virginia, you represent Eastern Ohio? It's a turnoff. The way I'd start it is, here's the facts. We know this is happening. How do we work together to do this, where everybody, it doesn't look like one group is getting clobbered and everybody else is walking off with millions of dollars. You got to get everybody around the table. You got to clearly, the only way this thing gets resolved in a decent way is a lot more scientific research. We're not going to be able to electrify and everything else our way out of this. We're going to need some research on carbon capture and everything else. Got to be part of the solution, and it's tough when our country is taking more of a lead, and India and China are basically ignoring a lot of this stuff. China's putting up more coal plants every month while we're closing them down. So we end up paying the fees. We end up penalizing our coal miners. You've got to bring some sense of equity to this thing, and getting everybody around the table is a good way to do that. We haven't been able to do this in this highly charged partisan environment. We have one group at the table, one side making a decision, they pass a law, they come out of power, the other group comes in and reverses it. That's not a very good way to handle tough issues like climate change, the deficit, and the border. And the end result is these issues just don't get resolved, and we don't make the progress that we could if we work together. You may be inching along a little bit when you do it together, but at least we all are moving in the right direction, as opposed to this zigzag we get today when Congress changes power, changes the hands of power, and the like.
You have a question?
Congressman, we talk about bias in the media a lot. We talk about the movement of the media to the extremes a lot. And a lot of that obviously is very true, but how much of that, particularly, in your opinion, as we're looking at here in Northern Virginia, we have a relatively robust local news scene. How much of that do you think has to do with the centralization of news and the consolidation of local news markets, that now all news is national news? My home state of Florida passing book bans, these are things that wouldn't happen in a Madison County 20 years ago, because, a Madison County Times would probably be there to say, here are the issues that are actually facing the community versus, versus something that's going on in a presidential race that we've already started 2 years early, as opposed to, Well,
I think the lack of local reporting, when I was on the county board, I got elected to the county board in 1979. I know I'm dating myself. I said, Jerry's known me all the times from being a wannabe to being a has-been. He's known me that through my whole career. You had local press all over you on every little issue. People following every board meeting, every word you make, and people were informed. You had you had the Fairfax Journal, you had the Connection, you had local papers that people got. That they have disappeared in a lot of places. And it has, in some sense, not just become nationalized, but the kind of scrutiny that you would get is now gone, because you just don't have enough reporters to cover a lot of this stuff. And so a lot of stuff gets swept under the rug. On book bans, I have maybe a different view than you do. When I came on the county board as chairman, I missed one meeting in 15 years. I had tickets to the Orioles game. I'm a huge baseball fan. And I went out one night, and it was a public hearing night, and I knew that the churches were going to pack the boardroom. And I handed the gavel to my vice chairman, Elaine McConnell. I said, Elaine, whatever they do, don't have the board take any action. Refer it to the staff for comment, and we can come back and do this another time. I'm driving back from the ball game, and it was a tough night because the Orioles had lost too. This is when there were no Nats in those days. So it was already a tough night. Long drive home, in traffic, and I get a call from a supervisor called Ernie Berger, who was a supervisor in Drainesville. He said, Tom, we have really done. I said, what are you doing? He said, Tom, we are on the side of the Angels. So I said, Ernie, what are you talking about? He said, we have just banned the gay blade from the Fairfax Library and abolished the library board. I said, Ernie, you might be on the side of the Angels, but you are not on the side of the voters. That's book banning. You can't do that. He said, well, we just did it. We voted 6-0. The crowd had packed the room. A bipartisan group got intimidated by the crowd, and instead of the chairman referring it to staff, took Berger's motion to ban this and voted it down. So we came in the next week, and of course we undid it. We got the attorneys down. We sat them behind closed doors. You have no idea what you're doing, and we put the blade lock on the library. By the way, I don't read the blade, but some of my constituents did, and I didn't think they should be deprived of that. So as you go to that was kind of my approach on that. Just a footnote to this. I was down in about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I was in Charleston where Supervisor Berger, who had made that motion to ban the Glade, had moved. And I met Ernie Berger and I met his partner. He was now out of the closet. So it just shows you how funny this stuff gets sometimes. But that was, I think, a tragic move for the board. It probably cost Elaine McConnell the chairmanship after I left it. That vote was a bad vote, but you get intimidated by the crowd sometimes.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to use book banning as a specific thing. I know that's a relatively hot topic now, but I just kind of, it was the most recent kind of move.
Well, I mean, one person's book ban, the school system has a right to say what books should be there and not. And I think there are some books that clearly shouldn't be in the school libraries in elementary school. I wouldn't put Playboy or some of those in the K through 6. Maybe you wouldn't call book ban.
I think we can certainly agree on not having.
Yeah, so it becomes on slicing it, and then it becomes about, how do we frame this issue to win public opinion? But we know what's going on in Florida.
All right, I guess moving on. So, as you were saying, Jerry Connolly knew you from when you were a wannabe to now, like you said, maybe you're a has-been. And so I guess my question is, as now a sort of outside observer of Congress, what do you think is the most crucial thing for them to pass right now? Maybe in totality, and then either for both parties?
Well, I just talked about 3 issues at the beginning that are just troubling to me that we haven't been able to move the needle much on. We talked a little bit about climate change. Despite everything else, it hasn't moved the needle much. Part of it's America's only a small piece of this. We can have a lengthy discussion, but we haven't been able to bring the country together and united behind it the way they are in some countries. But secondly is the deficit. We have a 1.2 to 1 debt to GDP ratio. What that means, somebody pays this off at some point, and it's probably not going to be me. Besides, I can afford to pay it off. It's going to be you. It's going to be your generation, and you're going to pay it off either through hyperinflation, or you'll pay it off just with reduced benefits when you get older and need it, or the economy crashes. Look, our debt to GDP ratio is not far from where Greece was, where they collapsed, and our dollar right now is under assault from the renminbi. Over in China, as countries now consider new market baskets, consider as a world currency. It's serious. And so the Republicans, when they talk about, we want some conditions before we raise the debt ceiling, there are precedents for that. By the way, there are precedents for members voting against raising the debt ceiling. Joe Biden did it twice. Obama did it twice when they were in Congress, the Republicans. So there's a lot of politicking. But just to cut to the fix on this, this is an unacceptable ratio, and you're going to have to resolve it in one of 2 ways. You're going to have to either raise revenue or you're going to have to cut spending. You can't continue the way it is going at this point because we know how this ends. It doesn't end well. We just don't know when it doesn't end well. And the inability of Congress to get together, even on raising the debt ceiling, is serious. Now, they have a deadline coming up. Hopefully they'll meet it with the brinkmanship that they usually go through. But it's a very legitimate issue in terms of bringing down that deficit on an annual basis. I was happy to be at the signing of the Deficit Reduction Act when President Clinton signed it. I was there in the picture behind it. I was a part of writing that, and we had 4 years where we ran surpluses in this country, believe it or not, in the 1990s. And we only did that, and it was tough, by bringing Republicans and Democrats together and recognizing that these long-term benefits, we couldn't start taking care of the poor, we couldn't start taking care of the elderly, infirm, and everything else if we didn't bring this back into some kind of reasonable cycle. And we did it. It was hard, it was a tough vote, and we did it by everybody giving up something. We voted for some revenue increases, we voted for some long-term reductions in spending. And then finally, the border. The border's a mess. We are a country, we're entitled to have to say who comes in and who comes out of this country. Every other country in the world does this or tries to do it. The answers are really pretty simple. When you need a high wall and you need a wide gate, but you need to be able to regulate who comes in. And that has now been off the table now for a decade. So you have millions of people running around with no documentation, no papers, can't get a job, and Congress just refuses to sit down and try to work something like this because you get ideologues on both sides don't want to make any kind of compromises. And so I was on the conference committee the last time both houses passed a meaningful bill. This was in 2007. And the Republican leadership said, this is just too hard, it splits our base, and we passed on that. Both parties have had a chance to do this since then, and they just found it split up their coalitions too much, and they decided to kick the can down the road. In the meantime, millions of more people, a lot of more contraband has flowed across the border, and we haven't dealt with it, and sooner or later there'll be a reckoning. And so I think those are real frustrations, that on those kind of big issues, where if you sit everybody around the table, you figure, you know, we're better off doing something than just ignoring it and doing nothing, like we have on the deficit and like we have, you know, on the border.
All right. And what do you think? Oh, are there any questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Please go to the microphone, or yeah.
Stand in the middle, really.
Yeah.
So we have seen a big push in the younger generation to run for office between trans rights, global warming, police reform, guns, and so many other issues that are important to young voters. But some say the lack of term limits, especially on the federal level, are not allowing younger generations to be represented. So my question to you is this: do you think there should be strict term limits on federal elected seats? And if yes, how would you support younger citizens running for office?
Well, I didn't wait. I ran against an incumbent. I was 29 years old, first time. And I didn't wait around. I ran in a district against an incumbent. Everybody thought you couldn't win. It was not doable. I got 63%. You get out and you try and you do it and you see what's there and you get some experience. We do have a number of young members now. You got Maxwell Frost, and now these members tend to be kind of a little bit of yahoos on the right and the left as they get up, and a little more ideologically fervent. That's not all bad, because you get in a few terms and you start learning the system and the way you get things done. A lot of times they calm down and become good members. A good example is Patrick McHenry. Patrick McHenry was 29 years old when he got elected, and you couldn't tell he knew everything. He was on my committee. I couldn't rely on him for a thing. He was so hard right. And over time, he grew up. He's now chairman of the Financial Services Committee, a very responsible member. I think he could be Speaker of the House someday. Kind of gets it. In fact, he was telling me a few weeks ago, he said, Tom, you were really good to me. I said, well, Patrick, what was I going to do? I don't believe you go after and punish members unilaterally because you may need them on the next vote. And he grew up, and I think so. Term limits, you lose that. You get all these people with the ideological fervor, and they come in, but they lack the experience. They lack the history, if you will. They lack kind of the gravitas that gives. The best term limits are really up to the voters. They can make those decisions. Now, yeah, you may get a Dianne Feinstein sometimes because voters are not always discerning in who they vote. And by the way, with it being all about the primary, that even lessens voter influence because you narrow it into one small election, which is putting your groups together. So I voted for term limits first time, but it takes a constitutional amendment to do that. And you're not going to get that. I mean, these are politicians you're asking to vote themselves out of job. Come on. Where this has happened is where you have states that have referendums. So in Washington State, years ago, they had a referendum that put term limits on their state legislature and Congress. The problem was the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, was from Washington State, and this put a term limit on him as Speaker. And he said, look, this disadvantages Washington because other states don't have term limits, and through a seniority system or a semi-seniority system, you're disadvantaging Washington State. So he sued in federal court, not to take away the state legislative term limits, but the congressional term limits on the argument that the Constitution set the standards for Congress, not state governments, and he won. His opponent was a young guy named George Nethercutt, who ran against Foley and said, I would never sue my constituents, i.e. the voters, who did, just to keep my job. And he won. He beat Foley. So Foley was out. Nethercutt took the term limits pledge, and then at the end of his term limits pledge, 3 terms, decided he was going to run again anyway. And he broke his own term limits pledge. So that give you perspective? Term limits basically turn this over to lobbyists, and they turn it over to the professional staff, which probably run the place anyway. But I think you lose a lot of gravitas with people who have dealt with these issues over time and bring some historical balance to issues that you don't have if you just have a bunch of newbies. So that's my current evolution of thought on that.
Oh, I was just.
Oh, okay. Okay, sure. Go ahead.
It's a pleasure to hear from you today, Representative Davis. So I'm interested in the polarization issue and coming up with an understanding solutions. I feel like, I don't know if this is a media thing, if this is just a human thing, there tends to be a lot of focus a lot of times on what's the magic bullet, right, kind of thinking. I'm curious if you have an outlook on a set of potential policies, or if there are organizations that you see doing good work to try to solve the problem, and also, strategically, what you think is going on that may be helpful, whether it's working at, the federal level to push something or working more locally. It's a little bit general, I know, but.
Yeah, look, I think there are a lot of good groups on the right and the left that have very good intentions. I'd add two things. If money and compassion could have solved our problems, they would have been solved a long time ago. The good intentions don't necessarily make good law or good policy. And, but interest groups drive that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you've got to have somebody at some point to ask the tough questions and try to put that into a final decision package. Look, we may end up next November with Trump versus Biden again. How many of you think that's a good choice for the country? 5% of Americans think that's a good choice. 70% said they don't want Biden to run again. 62% said they don't want Trump to run again. And yet, because of the way we are, that's where it is. Now, there is a group called No Labels. Have you heard about it? That are reserving the ballot in 50 states to run a if that is the ticket, to give a third alternative. And their goal is to have a Republican and Democrat on a unity ticket to try to unite us, not divide us. And there's some polling shows there's some space for that. There are some Democrats say, "Oh, this will just make Trump president." You're going to hear a lot about that in the coming months. But you think about two basically very old people, they're older than I am, running on each ticket that are basically been very polarizing figures running, and that's the choice we get. So I think group people asking some questions saying, can we do better than that? I think what No Labels is doing is very interesting. It should bring interesting conversation. I don't know that either party will accept it, but it's, we may end up with a really, really tough choice if that's where it comes down to. It'd be a tough choice for me. And so that's my choice, just gone, if this is the best we can do. But there are a lot of groups, right and left, that I think mean well, get organized well. Sometimes nobody puts the reins on them, and you run through a primary and you elect people, it's all or nothing. So I've talked to a lot of Republicans who know better on some issues, but they're worried about their party base and their primaries. I know Democrats, we just passed something called collective bargaining for public employees, for county governments, which I think is an absolutely stupid idea. And the reason is this: 80% of your county budget is public employees' salaries. And if they're allowed to collectively bargain, their salary is not going to be set by the elected board of supervisors. It's going to be set by an arbitrator. You're basically letting your arbitrator set the tax rate. Why would you give away that authority? Doesn't mean you can't be fair at the head and you lose control of your budgets. But it's the fear of what, in a Democratic primary, unions can do to you that drives members who told me privately they know better, just saying, I'm not going to fight that battle. I don't want to fight that. I was a whip for something called TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, when the economy started to unwind in 2008. I remember we got a member in the back room, and he said, "Man, I hope this thing passes." I said, "Well, I've got you down as a no vote." He said, "Well, I'm a no, but I hope it passes." I said, "Well, if you want it to pass, why can't you take a tough vote?" He said, "Tom, I could never explain this to my constituents." And I just said, "Well, why are you here? If you can't take a tough vote, you think this is that great a job? You like the parking place? I mean, what is it about this place that it's so great? I can tell you, having been both places, it's a lot more comfortable on the outside. But that's the way the place operates in this very polarized single-party district mentality where people are afraid to compromise because the primary is all that matters.
I think with that, I'd just like to say thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
Well, thank you all for being part of the audience.
Before you leave, we still have one more town hall with Karina Lipsman and Delegate Kay Corey that will be beginning in a few short minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gabriela Grabowska, and I'm an Undersecretary for Community Relations and Civic Engagement here at George Mason University. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Students on Air for inviting me to participate in this event. I'm happy to see you all here because right now we're starting a fascinating conversation, Women in Politics. It is my honor to introduce our two guests, two great politicians, two women fighting for the best of our state and our people. Karina Lipsman is a visiting fellow at Independence Women Forum who in 2022 ran for Virginia's 8th congressional district representing the Republican Party. She is a Ukrainian refugee and has 15 years of experience in the defense and intelligence sectors. Welcome to the stage, Karina Lipsman.
Thank you.
And joining us virtually, Kay Corey, who's a member of the Virginia's House of Delegates and represents the 38th District of Virginia. She's affiliated with the Democratic Party and has been working in the state government since 2010. Before that, she was on the Fairfax County School Board from 1999 to 2009. Round of applause, please. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and participation. Okay, let's start our conversation with a question for Delegate Corey. Can you hear us well?
Good morning, and thank you so much for allowing me to, boy, it's disconcerting. I see two pictures of myself. Yuck. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be able to join you virtually, and I appreciate your patience since I was not able to be there in person. I simply also want to thank you for highlighting women in politics. It is an increasingly important part of our democracy that women be given a voice themselves, not just through men. I'm not sure how much time you want me to speak at the moment. Let me just say that when I first began to be an elected official on the school board, there were two other women, out of 12, there were two other women besides me. And then when I started in the General Assembly, there were about 4 women. Now in the General Assembly, the women are in the majority in the Democratic Party and in the House, and also on the school board, women are in the majority. And it's been great to see that turnover.
Thank you. Delegate Corey, you have a great experience in politics. Fairfax County School Board, 14 years in the House of Delegates. But how did you first get into politics? What made you passionate about it? And what would you say influenced you the most throughout your journey?
Well, to answer the passionate question first, that's like when people ask me what are my the issues I concentrate on. The truth is I'm passionate about everything. I am passionate about quality of life and equity and improving access to resources. I was a community organizer for many years before I began to work for anti-poverty programs. Sorry, cats. And there's nothing I can do to make them stay away. And I then, let's see, so why did I run for office? It was not my first choice, that's for sure. I was extremely upset about the school system in Fairfax County, and after having a couple of children, 2 out of 3, go through the system, I was even more concerned about the lack of resources, the lack of effective education, especially about the facilities. When I first went to Jeb Stuart, which is now Justice, for back to school night, we couldn't get into the physics chemistry lab. It was roped off because it was too dangerous. It was a fire hazard. And when the teachers explained that to us, most of the parents went, oh, okay, fine, we won't go in there. That is not how I felt. I felt this is crazy, this is ridiculous. Fairfax County is one of the richest counties in the nation. Why in the world are we having this situation? And then when my daughter was at Glasgow, I was the PTA president, and one of my main jobs was to run over to the school when it rained and help put garbage bags over computers and protect the books because the ceiling leaked. And the final straw was one day my daughter called me and said, come and get me. The floor has melted and we can't walk down the main hallway. And that was because the heating system, steam heating system under the floor had broken and it melted the asbestos vinyl tiles. So I began to call my school board member literally every day and say, what are you doing about this? The result of that was we became real good friends. I don't know why he kept answering the phone, but he did. And not much happened in terms of improving the schools in my area. I realized then that equitable resource distribution is in fact political with a small p. And he asked me to help him run for, re-election as his campaign manager. And I said I would. And then he became ill and asked me if I would run in his place. So I ended up on the school board. And I'm very proud of the things I was able to accomplish. All of the, I'm sorry about my voice, all of the facilities in my district, literally all of them, got a renovation and an update. After 10 years on the school board, I felt like I had accomplished what I set out to accomplish, and I was not running for re-election. And then many of my constituents asked me to run for the House of Delegates.
Thank you so much. But
so that's it.
What are your...
I'm sorry, the sound is not that great. So if I'm shouting, go ahead.
It's okay. Question about your accomplishments. What would you consider as your best ones? Obviously, throughout all the years, 14 years in the House of Delegates, also the school board, you've accomplished a lot. But what are you the most proud of?
I am most proud of the quality of life improvements that I was able to accomplish. I'll explain that in a second. And I am really, really proud of the ERA, which I started, and the criminal justice reform that I was able to accomplish. I was able to get through the General Assembly when it was majority Republican, the legislation that allowed all women whom are incarcerated to have menstrual products distributed to them at no cost and upon request. And upon request is seriously important because until that legislation, women were literally having to prove that they needed menstrual products. They were also being required to pay. And it turns out that we were the first state ever in the country to do this, which is crazy. And a number of others followed suit. Real quickly, the quality of life issues I'm talking about are pedestrian safety, school safety, and a number of health issues. So that's a long story. I guess I'm most proud of the giving access to my constituents and trying in every way I could think of to listen to them and to convince them that they are part of the government. It is their government.
Thank you so much. Those are undoubtedly very important issues, and thank you for working on that. Now, Ms. Lipsman, I have a question for you. Could you please tell us more about your background? Your career is 14 years in the defense and intelligence communities, but what were your first steps in politics? And as we all know, there are always ups and downs. What helped you manage those? What influenced you throughout the political experience that you had?
So it's a great question. Again, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for having me. I think, having these bipartisan conversations is extremely important and really gives both sides a voice and brings us closer together as a society to move things forward. So thank you all for being here and doing what you're doing. For me, it was a very personal decision. I was born in Odessa, Ukraine, when it was still under Soviet regime. And so I've experienced the things that come with that kind of regime, like standing in bread lines, not having a voice, not being able to do things that you otherwise would be able to do here in the United States that we sometimes take for granted. And I saw the country moving in a direction which made it more and more polarizing. And I wanted to be the change that takes both ideologies on either side, because I would consider myself a very moderate person, even though I did run on the Republican ticket, and wanted to bring people together and really wanted to make sure that people could sit together and have a conversation and could appreciate each other's differing views. And I was like, well, who better to tell it than someone who's dealt with the oppressive side of it and has come to this beautiful country for the democracy that it allows. And then having spent the majority of my career in the defense and intelligence community, I saw things that we were not doing at the federal level. And I wanted to speak up about that, and I wanted to change that. So I felt that for me to be able to influence a lot of the international policies, a lot of what's going on domestically, being able to run for Congress was going to be the next step. And obviously that was not part of the plan. I never wanted to get into politics. I always thought that politics was a silly game. I was happy on the private sector side, but I was also happy serving this country. But the other reason why I got involved was because I wanted to be an example for the next generation to step up. Because we see a lot of people in politics today who have been there for decades. And things change, and we know things change. And we need new leadership, new blood, new perspectives in Congress to be able to progress our world and society and culture to accomplish that evolving next phase. So I wanted to show people that it doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what you have in your bank account. It's about wanting to do something different. And when you set your mind to something and actually want to accomplish something, things just start falling into place. You start meeting people. And that was something that, helped me and influenced me in my journey, is that as soon as I decided that I was going to run for Congress, people started showing up out of the woodwork, people I didn't know, and they wanted to have the conversation. They're like, well, why are you running? Well, what do you think you can do different than the last person? And, as a woman, you're always getting a lot of, flack for literally everything. And so they're like, well, you'll never survive. You'll never make it. What do you have to offer? And I was like, you know what? This is going to continue building my gumption, and I will prove you wrong. And so I started, and I just never looked back. And I had a fantastic time. I met so many people. I heard from so many people. I learned things that I would otherwise never have learned. And I came with a very open mind. I didn't come in with an agenda. I didn't come in to push something down someone's throat. I came in thinking, if I'm truly going to be the change, I have to act like the change. And what that means is I'm going to meet people where they are. I'm not going to force anything on them. And that really helped as I was going through this journey, which was exhausting. And if you guys ever decide to run for office, especially at the federal level, have a lot of stamina and have an outlet and have good people around you so they can support you. But I think it was very eye-opening experience for me. And I went from a refugee that came to this country with absolutely nothing, living in low-income housing on food stamps in a really bad part of Baltimore City, to them being a congressional nominee. So very proud of that.
That's impressive. Thank you so much. Your experience in international diplomacy, geopolitical strategy, and defense operations is so extensive. What were the best projects that you had an opportunity to work on? And what were the best moments and successes in that area of your work?
Yeah, so I got to travel the world, which was wonderful. I got to see a lot of what's going on in countries that are less fortunate than ours. I got to work with leaders across the globe on their defense strategies and how they protect their countries. I also got to do fun things like launch satellites. And work with commercial companies and work with the defense and intelligence community in being able to create collaboration and cooperation, which has not been done before. And I kind of spearheaded a lot of what we've been doing. And I was actually just talking with someone who worked at my previous employer, and he's like, you know, this digital transformation thing that was put into place a few years ago is really taking off. I was like, well, I kind of spearheaded that entire thing and brought it to the company and made it what it is because it was culture change. And a lot of the bureaucratic companies were not into culture change. They were not into, you know, very much, we've done it this way, we're going to continue doing it this way. And it's like, well, that's not how innovation breeds, and so we need to move forward. So it was really cool to hear that something that I've implemented years back is still having a huge impact now that, you know, I've gone and have done other things.
Great, thank you so much. What are your goals for the future?
Oh man, right now I decided that I wanted to do something very different than I have been doing, and so I've joined the nonprofit world. And I've been working with victims of communism and working alongside people who have escaped communist regimes and tell their stories and why they decided to escape and what was their life like and what are the impacts of living under that kind of oppression. And, you know, what are the potential impacts if you go down that route, right? Because it's not very obvious right away. It's more of, you know, we'll provide this grandiose, you know, world for you where you don't have to do anything. The government's just going to take care of you. And people who are less fortunate, because that's usually who it affects, they believe it. They want to believe it because that's hope. And we as people want to see the best in everything. And unfortunately, you have people that are not great and don't want to see the best in everything and called dictators and the authoritarians, and they create an environment where there's a small amount of people that have more power than the rest of the society and the rest of the people, and they control and dictate your every move. So it's interesting to hear their stories and hear their journeys as they've escaped those kinds of regimes and moved into a different kind of society, which is the democratic society we have here in the United States. And one more point, we actually just had, we exposed, the organization exposed the Uyghur slave labor in the Xinjiang Chinese province. And we had two female survivors who recounted their stories as part of a congressional hearing a couple of weeks ago. And it was the most powerful thing that I've ever heard in my entire life. And, you know, I came in a little bit early and heard Congressman Davis talk about, you know, climate change and, you know, how much the US is doing versus China and India. A lot of where, you know, how to relate that back is the Xinjiang province in China is the biggest producer of the polysilicon that goes into solar panels. And it's being produced using the slave laborers from the Uyghur population. And I learned all of this, and I was like, well, this is really sad from a human rights perspective. And, you know, what are we doing to mitigate that as a country, but then also what are we doing in terms of nonprofit organizations really putting pressure on China to stop these human rights atrocities?
Absolutely, we need to work on these problems all together. Yeah. Delegate Corey, let me go back to you. Since the day when you joined the world of politics, you got a lot of work done. Your people saw a lot of results, and you just mentioned earlier during our conversation all your accomplishments. But what do you think was unique about your way of serving in the office? What new perspectives as a woman in politics did you bring, and why do you think people re-elected you again and again?
Those are a lot of questions. I think first people elect me again and again because I listen and I act. I often reach out to all sides, all parties involved in any problem. And frankly, I tend to find what a lot of people call out-of-the-box solutions. And I would like to say something. First, I want to thank. Let me think. First, I want to thank the congressional candidate. I think that your point of view and your experience has a lot to offer, and I am so impressed listening to you. And I'm so glad that you've continued your activism, whether or not you've been elected to office. And I think it's important to look at legacy. I am very proud of the scholarship funds that I have established, the opportunities for developmentally disabled artists to show their work, and the way that I've been able to offer opportunities to people that don't really have them. When you mention communist China, there have been a number of women refugees from the slave labor camps that I met and brought to the General Assembly to introduce to the General Assembly. And I think the fact that I'm able to do that really makes the problems in the world personal and gives all of us an opportunity to fight against oppression of any kind. And I think that I have wandered away from some of your questions, and I do apologize. My attitude in general is everyone should be involved in politics is life. Don't tell me that you don't care about politics, because you care about if your schools are well run, you care about if the roads have holes in them, you care about if your mail is delivered. So everybody should realize that politics is affecting them, and politics is the way that we accomplish things in this country.
Thank you. What is unique about working in state government as opposed to federal government? We would like to hear some insights from your side and from your own experience.
Was that directed at me?
Yes, my apologies, Delegate Corey, that's the question.
No, that's okay. I think for me, it's important to be able to see the results of my work and to be able to show other people the effectiveness of working in the political arena. And frankly, a lot of congressional actions take years and years to affect your daily life. And to me, it's important that people realize that, as they say, the governmental levels that are closest to the people are the ones that affect their lives the most. And I find also that it's much clearer to young people like you who want to make the world better, and it's much clearer to them it's much clearer to them what their opportunities are when they see the difference that their actions make in their daily lives.
Thank you. Right now, we'll talk about women in politics because that's technically the name of our conversation. So, as we all know, we face a lot of challenges. We're significantly underrepresented. We're not taken seriously. We need to fight the gender barrier. We need to fight for our place in government and politics. What are the challenges that you both faced during your careers? have you ever had a situation when you wanted to give up just because you thought you didn't have a chance, just because you are a woman? Ms. Lipsman?
So this, I kind of touched on that earlier, is, I've always looked young, and I've always been the girl in the room because I've somehow got into the male-dominated industry of finance and defense. And so I was always the only girl in the room usually, and I was having to work harder than most. I have an undergrad in economics, which is the finance background, and then I found myself in the world of defense and intelligence, where I always felt inferior. And I struggled through imposter syndrome, and I struggled through not being good enough or not belonging because I didn't have the right credentials or, had the right experience or the right degrees. And so because of that, I actually ended up going back to school and getting a master's in engineering so that I could fit in and I felt comfortable being part of the discussions, even though I didn't need that degree. But to me personally, it felt like that was something that I had to get because of it, who I was and as a woman. In politics, I knew it wasn't going to be easier, but you're scrutinized that much more. Your appearance is everything. I remember one day when I was in my primary, and I remember doing videos, weekly videos on issues. And my hair is not always straight. My hair's a little bit out there, kinky, whatever. And I remember I was already in a rush, and I didn't have time to do my hair, so I taped this video with my hair being a little bit of a hot mess. And didn't really think of it, and I was like, you know what, it's all about my policies, it's what I have to offer. Not more than, I don't know, a couple hours after I posted that video, one of the constituents emailed me and said, it's shameful that you didn't put yourself together properly before you went on camera and decided to talk about issues that are important to this country. If I was a man, that would have never happened. I could have had bed head and all sorts of things going on and looked sloppy. No one would have commented. But because I was a woman, I was critiqued at any point. And it wasn't just by men, it was by women too, what that I noticed. If I was told during one event that women should be wearing a certain type of outfit if they wanted to be taken seriously. And I was just like, okay. So now I have to dress a certain way. I have to do this a certain way. I have to do my makeup. I have to do my hair. And so do you really bring your true, authentic self to the table and stay true to who you are as a person because you want to feel accepted by people? And you're never going to get 100% of everyone's approval. You're just not. And, the important thing to me was to stay true to myself and be authentic, regardless of what that looked like. So that's how I would overcome these things. And you have to have a little bit of a thicker skin. But another, example, and I'll hand it over to the delegate, because I'm sure she's got a ton as well. I was at a fundraising event. So a couple hosted a fundraiser for me, and we had a great discussion. We talked about international politics, and the topic, I think, was international trade and supply chains. And I knew a good bit about it, and so I answered to the best of my knowledge. And my campaign manager was also at the event and had very extensive background and policy experience in this particular topic. And so I answered, and then I lobbed it over for the more technical questions to my campaign manager, who happened to be a guy. And didn't think anything of it. I was like, okay, we answered the guy's question. Everything was great. After the event, the gentleman who asked the question came up to me and he said, that was absolutely unacceptable. I asked you the question and you didn't answer it, and you let this guy basically mansplain and speak on your behalf. And I was like, well, that's not what happened. I answered your question. I just didn't have the technical details. And so as someone who's an expert in this field, I wanted to make sure that your question was answered. And he's like, well, I would have never done that. I think that's so inappropriate. And again, I've seen this multiple times happen in other campaigns where it's, a male candidate and a campaign or a chief of staff, and they lob questions to each other and they have these conversations, and it's never an issue. But because, unfortunately, women are held to a higher standard sometimes, unfairly, it's just expected that it's perfection every single time, and it's not going to be perfection every single time.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing your experience, Delegate Corey. Any challenges, situations that you faced?
Yes, a lot of what she just said is true. Women are, in general, scrutinized more for their appearance and for their presentation, which is not only appearance. I agree. And frankly, that's been true my entire life. However, that prejudice, that discrimination has lessened over the last 10 years, let's say. But I think that attitude and that prejudice can be used, frankly, and that is what I have done. Yes, you have to work harder. Yes, you have to be smarter. You have to be a better speaker. You have to be willing to push yourself forward, because people are not necessarily going to ask you the question or ask you to be the leader because you're a woman. But on the other hand, frankly, many men are suckers, and you can use your appearance, you can use your feminine whatever as one more tool in the toolbox. And that's what I've done.
Thank you. That's great. Delegate Corey, you once said, we need more women in office and more women to support women running for office. What can we as a community do more to support women?
Oh, there is so much to do. And frankly, a lot of the ways that you can support women into public office. You're doing it right now. But what we also need to talk about is children, girls, and how our society still does not really protect them, prepare them for public office. I have spent a lot of time in the schools talking to girls and elementary school especially, talking to kids and saying, did you ever notice that there's no woman president ever in the United States? Why do you think that is? Who here would like to run for president? And setting up clubs to train girls to be leaders, strengthening the Girl Scouts. While the Girl Scouts may not be your favorite way of teaching women how to be leaders, many men come out of Boy Scouts, Eagle Scouts, whatever, and they are much more prepared for public office than the way the Girl Scouts train girls. I have looked for every opportunity that I could find to strengthen girls, to convince them that not only are they equal to men, but they're better. And I think I've got a lot of letters from girls to tell me how important that was to them. And frankly, I think that all of us need to be aware of the way girls and women are presented publicly, especially in the media. Every time, frankly, I see a quote unquote women's or girls magazine, I want to throw it in the trash, because that is not the image that we should be teaching girls that they have to live up to. This is probably a longer answer than you wanted, but I say every parent out there needs to boost their daughter, teach their daughter from the get-go that it's not about how pretty you are, it's about your ability. It's about what you can accomplish and training yourself to see the world that way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. These words are really important for us to hear. And your answer was perfect. It wasn't longer than we needed. It was amazing. Thank you. Just to conclude this conversation, this is for both of you. What advice would you give to younger women in this audience and just everyone who's going to watch this recording later who are interested in politics, who are considering running for the office in the future, who are considering pursuing a political career, who are considering changing the world? Ms. Lipsman, would you?
I mean, this is why part of the reason that I decided to run. I knew that I was running in a very difficult district. I knew it was an uphill battle that I was going to face. I knew that the likelihood of me winning was very slim to none. But I knew that I had to do something, because if I didn't, who would? And I think that's something that we remember as women and everybody, right? If you have strong beliefs, if you have a voice, which all of us do, make it heard. Don't be afraid. It doesn't matter if it's not the popular decision. It doesn't matter if it's not the popular, flavor of the day. Things change all the time. But it's so important that we don't look at ourselves as victims, but we look at ourselves as empowered individuals who have a reason and deserve to be where we are. And no one is lesser than anyone else. We're all equal as people. And I think that's really, really important, that we don't put ourselves down to that level. We talk about equality, we talk about women, facing a lot of the hardships that men usually do not face in a lot of these male-dominated industries. But we can't continue to have that victim mentality. We have to step up to the plate. And we have to do it for the next generation of women, because the generation previously have fought so hard to get us to where we are today. And we have to continue fighting for that next generation. We need to continue uplifting each other and not discounting each other. We're all different. That's what makes us unique. That's what makes it wonderful. That's how diversity works. You have different perspectives, but you have to respect other people's perspectives. Meet people where they are. Don't force your opinions on them, but really stay true to yourself during this entire process. People are going to tell you how to do things, when to do things, what to say it, how to dress, how to do your makeup, how to do your hair, etc. If it doesn't feel right, don't do it. Stay true to yourself. Be authentic. Authenticity is going to prevail. People notice it. People can sniff it out. If you're not being honest, if you're not being true to yourself, people will suss that out. And that's going to make it much worse than if you continue being and speaking your true self. I would also say that, you don't have to be an expert in everything. You don't. I told my example story of the fundraiser where I wasn't the technical expertise in this, international supply chain issue. It's okay. You don't have to be, but surrounding yourself with people who are and leaning on them, it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to know everything. I talk about never compromising. I really mean that. I really, truly mean that. Do not compromise who you are as an individual just to please other people. Because not only is that going to affect you and your mental health and who you are as a person, you're also not truly bringing yourself, your true self, to the table. And you're doing yourself a disjustice. Sorry, English is a second language. I overuse that. But you're also doing it to the people that you're surrounding yourself with, because you're there because they want to hear your opinion. And if they didn't want you there, they wouldn't have you there. So I would just say, persevere, make sure your voice is heard, stay true to yourself, be authentic.
Amazing advice, all the steps. Thank you so much. Delegate Corey, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think the summary that you just heard is excellent and everyone should take it to heart. However, sometimes I think all of us, whether we're in the political arena or not, don't really understand the advice, be authentic, and don't compromise. Because frankly, your personal views are what structures you and the way you see the world. But that is not what we're arguing about when we're trying to solve problems and bring people together. It's not about your views. It's about listening and working out, unfortunately, working out compromises. We don't get anything done unless we compromise. If you stand there and say, it has to be my way, only my way, well, good luck to you, because you're not going to accomplish anything. And the change happens in small, incremental steps. And it's very important to bring people together to have enough energy and strength to build to change. I would also say, yes, the whole world needs help, but work on what you know. Start in your own backyard. If you see problems, act on them. It doesn't have to be international. It doesn't have to be national. Just do what you're able to do, fix what you see, and remember to listen to other people, whether you agree with them or not. Allowing people to be heard is crucial to any kind of change. And finally, vote, 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 always vote, drag your friends, drag your neighbors, don't stop voting.
Sure, supporting democracy. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is out, but that was a great conversation. Thanks again for your time, Ms. Lipsman, Delegate Corey. We really appreciate your participation, and we'll see you, hopefully, doing a lot of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure. I really have learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriella, for moderating such a wonderful discussion with Ms. Karina Lipsman and Delegate Kay Corey. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you. Our students on air intern, Stella, will now give a brief closing remark.
All right, hi everyone. We just want to thank everyone for coming here and making this such a successful event. Everyone on the Students On Air team is so grateful. We're so grateful to student government for coming and supporting us, and all our other supporters here today. Our goal for Congress Day was to really engage students with their politicians and other people involved with government, and engage students with these hard conversations and looking at multiple perspectives. And I think we were very successful in doing that here today. We definitely hope to put on similar events in the future and to continue to connect the community of Mason with representatives, politicians, people involved in governance, and really continue to promote sharing different ideas and talking to each other. So again, just thank you so much for coming, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their Monday.